So when I think about formative assessment, I'm thinking about how do we help the diverse group of students that we have get toward the intended learning outcomes, whatever it is we're teaching in that lesson, in that sequence of lessons over the course of the unit. So we have, and I say we, it's a group of educators that has become larger and larger and larger until it's almost unowned by anybody. But we tend to think about 6 different principles for assessment for learning. The first principle is we set a target, and the students need to know. We sometimes call this a learning intention. We sometimes call this an essential question for the day. Sometimes it's displayed at the very beginning of the class. Sometimes it's drawn up at the end of the class. But before the class ends, each and every student needs to know this is what I was aiming toward accomplishing in this class, so that as they're leaving, they can be saying to themselves or to the teacher or to another one of their peers, according to this learning intention today, here's what I understand. So the target is clear in their minds. So that's the first part about formative assessment. That sounds so simple, but all of us as teachers can think of times when we've taught a lesson and in the midst of the lesson decided or discovered what it was we were really doing in there and what we wanted the kids to learn. So this means we have to be more planned. We have to think up front, what am I trying to teach here? And then planning my activities to match what I'm trying to teach. So we have a learning outcome. We also focus on changing the kinds of questions we ask. We have a bad track record of a lot of questions in the class that are closed, have yes-no answers, right, wrong, fill in the blanks. Very little thinking is required. If we want to look at questioning in a formative assessment way, we open up the questions so that they're inviting students into reasoning, and we focus on open questions rather than closed questions. Makes a big difference to the amount of cognition that each student is engaged in. And we, of course, also look at the piece that says 3 or 4 kids don't answer the questions. The questions are answered by everybody. All voices need to be heard in the class all the time. The third piece of questioning that I think about is whose questions. So we start by modeling the kinds of questions we want to ask to get that conversation going on in the classroom. But really we want to engage students in asking their own questions. And so that's another aspect of formative assessment. We think about peer assessment as part of formative assessment. We need to have clear expectations back to our learning outcomes. When thinking about formative assessment, we also want to think about who you can get feedback from. So you can get feedback from me, the teacher. That's great. But in a class of 30, if you're waiting for feedback to come from me, you wait a long time, especially if I'm trying to have the feedback be immediate or timely. Sometimes timely is different than immediate, and personal. So we really work to try and enable each and every student to give themselves feedback so that they can self-assess how they're doing at progressing toward a goal. And then with the ability to do that, that means they can work with a partner to give feedback and peer assessment. But it has to be very deliberate. You have to get beyond the nice words in this writing, or your spelling was good. This is not feedback that makes a difference. Our feedback we think of as coming around 3 questions. What's working? What's not? And what's next? So I model those questions in my work with the students in formative assessment, and then they start to use them themselves so that they can look against the outcomes and the criteria, which I'll talk about in a moment, and say, here's how I'm doing, here's what I think works so far, here's what I'm a bit fuzzy about, here's where I need some help. So you see that the dialogue in the classroom starts to change dramatically because students have more ownership of their learning, and they're better able to define what they're doing that's well, to articulate that, to recognize it, and then to say, here's where I need some help. So instead of just saying, I'm stuck, I don't know what to do, the student can say, here's what I do know of what I'm doing, and here's where my reasoning runs out. I've seen that work in grade 12 calculus classes, where instead of just the look of, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do now, and abject horror that comes on some students' faces, the teacher saying, well, look at the question and tell me something about it, anything about it that you know. so that you start from that piece of, okay, I'm not a total blank slate. There's something in here I know, and then I'm better able to see what it is I need next. So we think about learning intentions, we think about better questions, we think about feedback, we think about peer and self-assessment, and we think about that piece about ownership. The other piece that we add in here is criteria, and that's developing criteria with students rather than giving it to them, developing it with them because it's more powerful to say, what will success look like? How will I know when I'm doing this in a correct way? Now, that criteria we develop in anything. It can be a tennis serve. It can be criteria for a powerfully written descriptive paragraph. It can be criteria for a description in a lab report that explains why the hypothesis was proven or wasn't proven. But we build it with the students, again, because that helps everybody have a clearer understanding. And then when students are having their conversations with themselves or with somebody else, they refer back to the criteria as the criteria is being used to get toward the learning intention.